Imagine living through the moment the world's most terrifying war was about to begin. A destruction so total that humanity had never even imagined anything like it before. And it all started with a promise that was destined to break. This is the story of the greatest war in history, a story that began the moment the first war ended. But in reality, that ending only opened the door to an even greater catastrophe. It was 1918, the 11th day of November, 11 in the morning. And the First World War officially came to an end. But in that very moment, nobody could have guessed that in just 20 years an even more horrifying war would erupt. Germany at that point was a defeated nation, its emperor forced to abdicate, its army exhausted, its people starving, but a dangerous lie had taken root in people's minds. The lie that Germany had never actually been beaten on the battlefield, that it had been betrayed by its own politicians instead. This lie would prove catastrophic. It would become the foundation of a new war. At the time, American President Woodrow Wilson presented a new dream, the dream of a League of Nations, where instead of fighting, countries would resolve their disputes through dialogue. Old empires were broken apart and new countries were created: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and several others. But hidden inside this new map was a ticking time bomb. Many of these new countries had large German populations living inside them. And one day these Germans would want to reunite with their homeland, a desire that would set Europe ablaze all over again. Germany was hit with a massive reparations bill, so huge that it crushed the economy. And when Wilson returned home, his own Congress turned against his dream. America refused to join the League of Nations and turned its back on the world's problems. Germany was now a new country, a democratic one known as the Weimar Republic. But this government was weak from the very beginning. Streets were filled with clashes between communists and right-wing groups. Then in 1923, Germany's economy collapsed so badly that people's entire life savings vanished overnight. This was the environment that gave rise to a new face: Adolf Hitler, born in Austria. He had fought bravely in the First World War and returned home to take control of a small party in Munich, the National Socialist Party, which the world would come to know as the Nazi Party. In 1923, he attempted an armed uprising against the government. It failed. He was sent to prison. And in prison he wrote his book Mein Kampf, in which he blamed all of Germany's troubles on the Jews and declared his intention to seize new territory in the East. After his release, he began building his party into a serious political force. For the next 5 years, Germany improved slightly. But then in 1929, the American stock market crashed and economic devastation spread across the entire world. Unemployment in Germany soared past 6 million, and only the extremist politicians seemed to offer any kind of solution. Hitler's party grew rapidly, backed by its own paramilitary thugs known as the SA. In the 1932 elections, the Nazi Party became the largest party in parliament, and finally in January 1933, the aging President Hindenburg was forced to appoint Hitler as chancellor. Within just a month, the parliament building burned down. Hitler blamed the communists and used the incident to grant himself emergency powers. He then banned every other political party, and when Hindenburg died in 1934, Hitler declared himself both president and chancellor. He was now the absolute ruler, the Führer. For the next 3 years, he put on a public show of rebuilding the economy. But in secret, he was rapidly rebuilding his military. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the German army had been limited to just 100,000 men, with no air force allowed at all. But in 1935, Hitler openly unveiled his new air force, the Luftwaffe, which already had more aircraft than Britain or France combined. Unemployment plunged and the Nazi Party's popularity soared. Hitler now made his first expansionist move, sending troops into the Rhineland, the area that was supposed to remain demilitarized under the Versailles Treaty. Neither Britain nor France objected. Everyone assumed Hitler was simply reclaiming what already belonged to Germany. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a new danger was rising: Japan, which had already defeated Russia back in 1905. Its population was exploding, but it had almost no natural resources of its own. Its eyes turned toward Chinese Manchuria, rich in coal and minerals, in 1931. Without even informing its own elected government, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria and set up a puppet state called Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but Japan simply refused to accept the ruling and walked out of the League entirely. The League had no way to actually stop them. Then in 1937, Japan invaded the rest of China, and when its capital Nanking fell, what happened next remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. Over 300,000 civilians were massacred within 6 weeks, and still the Western powers refused to intervene. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini had already built his own fascist movement. Marching on Rome in 1922 and forcing the king to hand him power, Mussolini consolidated his control, and then in 1935 invaded Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia. A modern army against a poorly equipped African force stood little chance. The League of Nations only imposed weak economic sanctions which achieved nothing. This was final proof that the organization meant to preserve world peace was completely powerless, and both Britain and France wanted nothing to do with another war. Their economies and armies had been devastated by the previous war. France adopted a purely defensive strategy, building the massive Maginot Line of fortifications along its border with Germany. Meanwhile, in 1936, civil war erupted in Spain. General Francisco Franco launched a rebellion, and Hitler and Mussolini openly supported him. sending tanks, aircraft, and troops, giving Franco's forces a chance to test weapons that would soon be used elsewhere. Britain and France adopted a policy of non-intervention, even as Germany and Italy openly mocked that same agreement. After 3 years of brutal bloodshed, Franco won in 1939. And Hitler became convinced that Britain and France were weak and would never seriously stand in his way. Hitler now set his true plan into motion, pressuring Austria in February 1938 and annexing it into Germany the following month without a single shot fired. His eyes then turned to Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, home to a large German population. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler twice, and at Munich an agreement was signed handing over the Sudetenland to Germany. Chamberlain returned home declaring he had secured peace in our time. But within just 6 months, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia entirely. His attention now shifted to Poland. This time Britain and France declared clearly that an attack on Poland meant war, but Hitler no longer cared. In August 1939, Hitler signed a secret pact with Stalin, secretly agreeing to divide Poland between them. And on the 1st of September 1939, German forces invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. But Poland had no answer for this brand new style of warfare known as blitzkrieg, fast-moving tanks. Aircraft and infantry combined to tear through enemy lines. Within just 4 weeks, Poland collapsed, and Germany and the Soviet Union divided the country between themselves. It was in Poland that the Nazi regime first revealed its true face. SS units began forcing Jews into ghettos, while Britain and France did very little during this period, focusing only on strengthening their own borders. This quiet period became known as the Phony War, but Hitler was already preparing his next move. His generals initially proposed a plan resembling the old Schlieffen Plan from the First War, but General Erich von Manstein proposed a far riskier and more brilliant plan instead, striking through the Ardennes forest, an area considered impossible for tanks and therefore lightly defended. In May 1940, the very same day Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, Hitler launched his assault. German paratroopers dropped into Holland and Belgium, while the true striking force of panzers cut through the Ardennes. Within days, General Heinz Guderian's forces crossed the river near Sedan and surged forward like lightning. French and British forces that had advanced into Belgium suddenly found themselves cut off from behind. French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud called Churchill and said simply, "We are beaten." But the German forces had a weakness too. Their panzer spearhead had raced far ahead of their infantry, stretching their supply lines dangerously thin. Hitler himself ordered a pause to let his forces regroup, and that pause gave Britain the time it desperately needed. From the beaches of Dunkirk came a miracle known as Operation Dynamo. Destroyers, fishing boats, and ordinary civilian vessels together rescued more than 300,000 soldiers back to Britain, a military defeat that became an emotional and strategic victory. But France's fall was now inevitable. German troops marched into Paris, and on the 14th of June the swastika was raised over the Eiffel Tower. France surrendered, and Britain now stood entirely alone against the full might of Nazi-controlled Europe. Churchill delivered his now legendary speech, declaring that they would fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, and in the hills, and that they would never surrender. Hitler assumed Britain would soon seek peace, but Churchill rejected every offer. Hitler then planned Operation Sea Lion, a naval invasion of Britain, but first he needed control of the skies. And this is where the Battle of Britain began. The German Luftwaffe had roughly 2,600 aircraft compared to Britain's Royal Air Force, which had barely 700. But Britain possessed a secret weapon, radar, known as the Chain Home System, capable of detecting enemy aircraft from miles away. This allowed Air Marshal Hugh Dowding to deploy his limited fighters exactly where and when they were needed most. For weeks the two air forces fought fiercely in the skies, until on the 24th of August German bombers accidentally struck London by mistake. Britain retaliated by bombing Berlin. An enraged Hitler shifted his entire strategy, now targeting London directly in what became known as the Blitz. Night after night London was bombed relentlessly. But this shift gave the exhausted Royal Air Force the breathing room it needed to recover, and on the 17th of September Hitler was forced to postpone Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Britain had won, but it still stood alone. Throughout this period Churchill maintained constant contact with American President Franklin Roosevelt, who wanted to help Britain but faced a public firmly opposed to entering another European war. Slowly Roosevelt began preparing his nation for what was coming. Using the Lend-Lease program to supply weapons and equipment to Britain and later to China, meanwhile another secret war was unfolding at Bletchley Park, where British scientists and mathematicians, including Alan Turing, worked tirelessly to crack the German Enigma code. This secret intelligence, codenamed Ultra, would prove absolutely vital in the years ahead, and was guarded so carefully that the Germans never suspected it existed. Churchill also formed commando units to launch raids along the coasts of occupied Europe, and established the Special Operations Executive to build resistance networks across the continent. But Hitler's true ambition lay elsewhere. He had always believed the Soviet Union was his ultimate enemy, and in June 1941 he launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion involving 4 million soldiers, the largest military campaign in history. Stalin had no idea it was coming. His own army had already been weakened by his brutal purges. German panzers advanced rapidly through Soviet territory, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But Hitler made a critical strategic mistake, halting the advance toward Moscow to redirect forces toward Kiev instead. This delay gave the Soviets crucial time to regroup, and when German forces finally approached Moscow, the brutal Russian winter turned against them. Tank engines froze solid, soldiers suffered severe frostbite. In December, the Soviet army launched a powerful counterattack that pushed the Germans back. That same month, in December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and Hitler, without any real strategic reason, declared war on the United States as well. The tide of the war was about to turn completely. In 1942, Hitler redirected his forces towards Soviet oil fields in the south, and during this campaign his focus fell on the city of Stalingrad. A city with little real military value but symbolic significance because it bore Stalin's name. What followed became one of the bloodiest battles in human history. For months, German and Soviet forces fought street by street, building by building. Then in November 1942, Soviet forces completely encircled the German Sixth Army. Hitler refused to allow a retreat. By January 1943, General Paulus was forced to surrender. More than 100,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Only about 5,000 would ever return home. The defeat at Stalingrad completely reversed the momentum of the war. The Soviet army was now on the offensive, and German forces were steadily pushed back. Then in July 1943, near the city of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history took place. Hitler deployed his newest Tiger and Panther tanks, but Soviet intelligence already knew the attack was coming and had prepared deep, heavily fortified defensive lines. When Soviet reserves entered the battle, German forces suffered a catastrophic defeat. After Kursk, Germany would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The tide of war had turned permanently. This was the moment that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. A collapse that would reshape the entire world within just a few short years, and stands as proof that no power, no matter how strong it seems, can survive its own arrogance and its own catastrophic decisions forever. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you stay for the next part, where we cover D-Day, the fall of Berlin, and the final end of the deadliest war in human history.